He was horrified. He didn't know what to think. From the very first second he said, "I've been framed, I don't know anything about this." Everybody knew, including the Singaporeans, because the tip-off came through them, that somebody had done this to him.
So Natalie, you reported a series of stories on Philip Sceats. What happened to him?
This is one of the most interesting cases I've ever worked on. This is the case of a gentleman who lives here in Sydney who was going on a holiday, he thought, to Langkawi in Malaysia, and he was arrested on his way in Singapore with cocaine in his luggage. He was charged and he was on death row facing execution for carrying cocaine. He'd gone in March 2018 on this trip. His family had bought him a ticket. He was a very humble, sort of hardworking guy. They decided to take him on a trip for his birthday. He ended up leaving the plane in Singapore. He had to change planes on his way to Langkawi, and that's where he was arrested. His family didn't believe that he'd done it, and he certainly said, "I have nothing to do with this. It's got nothing to do with me. I've been framed," from the very first second. And his family then brought in a team of investigators to try and find out what happened.
Before all the kind of drama unfolds, he was living a relatively normal family life in Sydney's eastern suburbs, would you say?
Yes, definitely. He worked hard, he went to the office every day, he was running the jewellery business, he's the father of 4 daughters, husband, he was growing veggies, he had a cat, completely normal life.
Ahead of this trip, he packs his suitcase in the car. He's presumably excited. He's going to go overseas to Langkawi for a holiday to celebrate his birthday. Talk us through what happens next when he gets off the plane in Singapore.
Yeah, he was very excited. He got on the plane in Sydney at about 7 p.m. on that night. He flew into Singapore. He was due to change planes, but there was several hours in between those planes, and so his family had booked him a hotel at the airport to freshen up. So it was about 5 hours I think he had to wait. So he had to clear customs, take his bags, and then go to the hotel and then check in some hours later. When he got off the plane, he noticed a couple of airport officials were standing near the gateway where he was leaving the plane. And he noticed them, he said later, because one of them was quite tall and the other one was quite short. And he sort of thought to himself, oh, they look a bit like Laurel and Hardy. He went downstairs and he went through immigration, and just as he was leaving the desk, they checked his passport, an official called him back by name and said, "Philip Sceats, is that you? Please come back." And the 2 men that he'd seen waiting near the door of the aircraft, they were looking for him. And then they took him off and said, "Where's your luggage?" And he said, "Well, it's obviously on the carousel, hasn't come out yet, I haven't got it." So they took him over to the carousel, waited for his bag to come out. Then they took it to an X-ray machine and had a look. And then they took him away to a room and opened up the bag, and almost immediately you could see that there were 2 packets of white powder that had been put into the bag, but not very well hidden.
Do you know what the quantity was of the cocaine?
Yes, it was just under 90 grams, I think. It's a trafficable amount, and it means that if you're found guilty in Singapore, you'll be executed.
Did he tell you what his reaction was when he saw those packets sitting there in his luggage?
He did. He thought someone was playing a joke on him. He thought somehow someone had put them in there and it was all a joke and it would be revealed. And when it wasn't revealed and they said, "We're taking you away to charge you, you're coming with us," he was horrified. He didn't know what to think.
So that's terrifying. I mean, his fate then is potentially death, isn't it, if he's found guilty?
From the very first second he said, "I've been framed, I don't know anything about this." He was taken off and put in a cell in Changi prison. His family didn't know where he was for a couple of days, I think it was, before he wasn't allowed to call anybody until they were told what was going on. Once they'd had a chance to hear the story, they got hold of a Singapore lawyer. He's one of the best in Singapore, Americ Gill, and they asked him to take on the case. And Americ Gill, in consultation with the family, decided that they needed to get some private investigators on the case. What came together out of their conversations, but also the Singaporean investigators, because they also did their own investigation. What all of them came up with was somebody had rung the Singaporean authorities and tipped them off, saying that Mr. Sceats would be coming into Singapore at this time, on his way somewhere else, carrying some drugs. So everybody knew, including the Singaporeans, because the tip-off came through them, that somebody had done this to him. One of the most unusual things about this case, and what they immediately recognised, is this is not a case of somebody smuggling drugs to make money. You don't smuggle cocaine or any other sort of drug from Australia to Singapore. Australia has the highest price of drugs in the world because it takes so much effort to get them to Australia. It makes no sense to smuggle 90 grams of cocaine, which probably costs between $27,000 and $30,000 in Australia, to Singapore and sell it for half that price. You would lose money selling that amount of cocaine. Any amount of cocaine that you paid for in Australia would be at a loss in Southeast Asia. They asked him to release all of his bank accounts and all of his phone records to have a look at them. And they wanted to satisfy themselves that he hadn't been in contact with anybody in Singapore or in Malaysia, where his ultimate destination was Langkawi. And he opened up his bank account, said, have a look. You'll see there's no $27,000, $30,000 taken out for this. And he showed them all the phone records. He had no phone calls or messages or communications with anybody in Singapore or Malaysia. In fact, he hadn't even booked his own holiday. It was a surprise booked for him by his family. So the Singaporeans, in their investigation, asked him if he would take a lie detector test. And he said, yes, of course. So they put all of the allegations to him in the lie detector test, and he passed. Philip is still stuck in the prison. He's been there for 300 days, I think it is at this stage. The investigators in Australia, including the police, are pulling out all stops. So they're contacting the Australian Federal Police, they contacted New South Wales Police. They tried to bring everyone in to help, to have a look at what they knew. Did they have any information that might have helped? Once they sent off that investigative report, they sat back and were waiting, and the Singaporeans had said, send us everything you have, because we're about to send him off for the trial. Oliver Lawrence was in Queensland, I think at home in Queensland, when he got a phone call from the Singaporeans and from Americ Gill, Mr. Sceats' lawyer, saying, you need to come to Singapore now. They're going to release him. He was beyond shocked. Mr. Sceats didn't know himself. It all happened very quickly. He was still in his cell. He was woken up he said, I think it was 4 a.m. in the morning, and they didn't tell him what was happening. They just said, you're required in court, so get dressed, we're going to take you to the court. And when it happened, he said that Mr. Sceats said to me, the judge almost had a little smile on his face when he said, I formally withdraw this charge. Mr. Sceats, who'd been facing execution by the gallows, said his legs just gave way. He just couldn't stand up any longer. He was so overwhelmed with emotion and shock that he just fell down. That's
a lot to process. He's free, and that's amazing, but on his shoulders he's got the knowledge that someone stitched him up, someone did this to him. And can you ever live a normal life again after something like that?
I don't think so. I think the first 24 hours he was released into the custody of his lawyer and the investigator Oliver, and they took him out for dinner. He had the birthday cake he should have had the year before. He was in jail for 353 days, I think it was, on death row, and he was just beyond shocked and relieved, but also I think suffering from enormous stress, because he really didn't know what had happened or how it had happened or who had done this to him. But the story didn't stop there. He was too traumatised to talk for quite some time, and I didn't speak to him until he came home.
Are the investigations still continuing?
They are on my behalf and his family. I know that they were asked to find out from the Singaporean authorities in an official capacity, so a request from the Australian Attorney General's Department to the Singaporean Attorney General's Department for the information about the person who made that phone call, because that is the clue that gives you the whole case, unravels the whole case. In the meantime, when Philip was able to talk to me, he revealed, as did his daughters, that he had been the subject of something similar only a few years beforehand. It was 2 years before. They were all going on a family holiday to Malaysia, or Southeast Asia somewhere, and he was stopped at Sydney Airport. I think it was 2016. Something similar. They knew it was him. They asked him to step aside. They were going through his bags and he said, "What are you looking for? Why have you sort of singled me out? I'm here with my whole family, my daughters." And they said, "Oh, somebody's said that you'd be carrying something." And he was really shocked at the time. They didn't find anything and they went off on the holiday and came back. But he said he couldn't stop thinking about that. While he was in prison in Singapore, and even after he came back, he kept wondering, were those things connected? Was it the same person? The first time he'd been stopped and disrupted, and they'd seen that, this could have worked. The second time, he was jailed and on death row, facing the gallows. I put in a Freedom of Information request to find out, and it turns out that somebody who was anonymous had run Crime Stoppers in the same way and said, "You need to stop this person, Philip Sceats, and go through his luggage." We don't know who that person is. I'm not sure whether the anonymous tip-off, their details were kept. I think they probably must have, but I'm still investigating that. And Philip certainly wants it investigated. Whoever wanted him out of the way hasn't been caught. The biggest question you have to ask yourself is, do they still want him out of the way? And would they do something like that again?